During the evening hours of February 16, 1944, approximately 60,000 troops from Germany plunged headlong into a snowstorm, crying out battle cries and wielding their fixed blades, advancing not towards triumph, but toward what those who lived through it would name Hell's Gate, a place where mounted Soviet forces would strike them down with slashing weapons, claiming more than a third of their number in the frozen landscape. This engagement at Korsun-Cherkassy, a largely overlooked parallel to Stalingrad, foreshadowed disasters yet to unfold. The conflict revealed all the elements that would render the Red Army an irresistible force. During 1944, Marshal Zhukov orchestrated vast pincer movements spanning numerous battlefronts. The Führer prohibited his forces from withdrawing until evacuation became unfeasible. When the surrounded soldiers at last attempted their escape, they encountered a nightmarish scene combining mounted attacks and bombardment that claimed 20,000 lives during those dark hours. 4 months afterward, Soviet forces would employ identical methods during Operation Bagration to obliterate Army Group Center, eliminating or taking prisoner 450,000 Wehrmacht personnel. The Korsun-Cherkassy engagement served as the forewarning. Bagration became the calamity. Between these events lies a profoundly troubling historical question. How could the painful teachings go unheeded? If you're interested in how wars are actually decided by logistics, math, and doctrine, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for more in-depth World War II analysis. Let's continue. By January 1944, Soviet commanders had absorbed the harsh teachings from Stalingrad. They now stood prepared to impart those same brutal lessons. Germany's 8th Army held a pronounced projection in their defensive positions northeast of Cherkassy, extending along the Dnieper River. Strategists refer to these projections as salients. Such formations provide defensive advantages and an advanced positioning. However, they simultaneously create vulnerability to surrounding maneuvers. German planners recognized the former benefit. Marshal Georgy Zhukov perceived the latter opportunity. On January 24, 1944, Zhukov orchestrated an unprecedented action, a coordinated assault across multiple sectors that committed 400,000 Red Army personnel, 500 armored vehicles, and 5,000 artillery pieces targeting the exposed German position. The Second Ukrainian Front, commanded by General Ivan Konev, struck from northern and western directions. Concurrently, the First Ukrainian Front under General Nikolai Vatutin launched attacks from eastern and southern approaches. This represented far more than a straightforward attack. This constituted operational-scale combat, the synchronization of distinct military formations spanning hundreds of kilometers to accomplish a unified strategic goal. The magnitude demonstrated how dramatically Soviet military competence had progressed since those dark months of 1941. 5 entire ground formations maneuvered together. No fewer than 1,000 combat aircraft delivered overhead assistance. The numerical imbalance proved overwhelming. 400,000 Soviet troops confronting 60,000 Germans caught within the salient. These figures did not reflect evenly matched opponents exchanging blows. These numbers represented an industrial powerhouse that had mastered applying crushing superiority with calculated exactness. The encircling arms closed with startling rapidity. Merely 4 days following the campaign's initiation, on January 28th, both Soviet fronts linked up in the vicinity of Zvenigorodka along the Gniloi-Tikich River. 6 German formations, totaling 60,000 personnel, discovered themselves encircled within a roughly round-shaped pocket focused on Korsun. The encirclement's pace revealed the operational philosophy that rendered Soviet deep penetration strategies so lethal. Where previous surrounding operations required weeks and permitted withdrawal routes to stay accessible, Zhukov's formations sealed their trap in under 7 days. This marked the initial occasion since Stalingrad that Red Army forces had effectively surrounded a substantial Wehrmacht formation. Yet Stalingrad required months of grinding city fighting before the encirclement achieved completion. Korsun required 4 days. The Soviets hadn't merely duplicated their previous achievement, they had perfected it, converted it to doctrine, and transformed encirclement from a risky gambit into standard procedure deployable at their discretion. However, as Zhukov's trap sealed around 60,000 German troops, one individual 1,500 kilometers distant would issue the directive that converted encirclement into complete destruction. The pocket might have been evacuated. Escape routes existed. Manstein's armored forces were advancing, but the Führer had different intentions. During those crucial initial days following encirclement, when withdrawal paths remained comparatively accessible and the Soviet cordon hadn't yet hardened, Hitler issued a directive that determined the destiny of 60,000 soldiers. He declared Korsun a stronghold on the Dnieper. The designation carried weight. Strongholds maintain position. Strongholds don't withdraw. Strongholds engage where positioned until reinforcement comes or enemies falter. Hitler had applied this identical reasoning at Stalingrad, where the Sixth Army maintained its ground until it stopped existing as an effective combat force. The Führer's battlefield meddling extended past symbolic pronouncements. He commanded the surrounded formations to launch a counter-encircling action targeting the Soviet spearheads. The concept was strategically nonsensical. The Germans within the pocket possessed neither sufficient numbers nor movement capability to surround Red Army units that outnumbered them roughly 7-1. Yet the directive consumed invaluable days. Days when the pocket remained comparatively secure. Days when systematic evacuation remained feasible. Days that would never come again. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein grasped what the Führer failed to comprehend. Time represented the adversary. Manstein commanded Army Group South and carried accountability for the surrounded formations. He arranged two significant relief efforts to penetrate toward the pocket from outside. The initial effort broke past preliminary Soviet barriers on February 4th, but stalled as terrible weather merged with determined Red Army opposition. The landscape became quagmire, the progress halted. Manstein reinforced and attempted once more. On February 11th, German armor initiated a second, more substantially reinforced relief effort. What transpired became among the great armored clashes of the conflict. Hundreds of combat vehicles battling across frozen terrain in a frantic race to contact the pocket. Soviet and German armor exchanged fire at distances counted in hundreds of yards. Crews battled and perished in steel containers that shielded against small arms, but transformed into death traps when struck by anti-tank ammunition. The engagement continued for hours. The panzers never approached nearer than 25 kilometers to the pocket. 25 kilometers could have been 250. The surrounded foot soldiers couldn't traverse that expanse through Red Army-held ground without facing annihilation. The relief column couldn't proceed further without risking its own encirclement. The separation remained impossible to bridge. By mid-February, the mathematics of survival had turned merciless. Provisions within the pocket diminished. Munition reserves dropped. The injured gathered in medical stations lacking medications and warmth. Soviet units compressed the perimeter. 25 kilometers distant, Manstein's depleted panzers remained stationary, having exhausted their capacity in unsuccessful attempts to span an unbridgeable gap. By mid-February, with rescue formations frozen 25 kilometers away and resources depleted, a single choice remained, leading directly through a slaughter zone the survivors would permanently remember. They rushed into darkness with blades attached and war cries upon their mouths. 60,000 soldiers wagering everything on a single frantic sprint towards survival. Late during the evening of February 16th, the initial German escape formation advanced forward. Officers issued the command. Soldiers affixed bayonets to weapons. The shout rose up. Hurrah! They surged into blackness, hoping velocity and unexpectedness would propel them past Soviet positions before defenders could mount organized opposition. For a fleeting instant, the wager appeared successful. The opening assault struck Soviet advance positions unprepared. Germans penetrated the initial barrier line. Then weather interfered with devastating timing. A violent snowstorm struck the combat zone. Snow already accumulated a meter high on terrain suddenly intensified. Sight range diminished to several meters. Temperature dropped precipitously. Winds screamed across exposed steppes, driving precipitation sideways into the expressions of soldiers attempting navigation by instrument and despair. Units lost connection with neighboring formations. Officers lost visual contact with their own troops. The escape column, which had preserved some semblance of structure during the opening surge, started fragmenting into smaller clusters, staggering through the tempest. At exactly this instant, when 60,000 soldiers most desperately required leadership, authority disintegrated. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Stemmermann had arranged relief operations moments prior. He comprehended the landscape. He possessed knowledge of the strategy. He was endeavoring to synchronize the escape across several formations when Soviet bombardment located his station. A direct strike terminated him immediately. One instant, the surrounded units possessed a leader. The following instant, they possessed a corpse and 60,000 leaderless troops amid a Soviet destruction zone. The disintegration of German authority structure meant nobody existed to direct the frantic mass of humanity advancing through the blizzard. Lower-ranking officers reached conclusions based upon what they could observe, which amounted to virtually nothing. Troops followed whoever appeared certain, which frequently meant following other disoriented individuals. The escape, which had commenced as a military action with established objectives and synchronized movements, deteriorated into a crowd, fleeing through tempest toward theoretical refuge they couldn't perceive and might never attain. Yet as morning arrived on February 17th and the snowstorm raged, the Red Army stood ready. And they had arranged something archaic. What transpired next transcended warfare. It constituted slaughter. As the concentration of German foot soldiers neared the confined passage that survivors would designate Hell's Gate, the hillside exploded with thunder. Soviet bombardment, automatic weapons, and armor fire crashed into the vulnerable formations. The spectacle became absolute horror. Soldiers who had endured the opening surge, endured the snowstorm, endured the darkness without their leader, now perished by hundreds as ordnance poured into the compressed mass of humanity, attempting to compress through the restricted withdrawal route. Soviet armor proceeded directly into the German formations. Operators drove their machines over transport, over the injured lying upon terrain, over individuals frantically attempting escape. The armor crushed everything along their route. Steel tracks pulverized flesh and skeleton into frozen earth. Survivors recounted witnessing wounded colleagues vanish beneath advancing T-34s. Their cries terminated by tons of steel. Then arrived something from an entirely different era. The Soviet 5th Guards Cavalry Corps charged into the German concentration. Mounted troops rode down their targets and struck with their bladed weapons. In 1944, with armor and aviation and artillery controlling the combat zone, soldiers on mounts killed using edge weapons. The mounted assault succeeded because German organization had utterly collapsed. The troops staggering through Hell's Gate weren't a military unit. They were individuals attempting survival. They possessed no reciprocal assistance. They possessed no unified protection. They possessed nothing beyond hope that the subsequent step wouldn't prove their final one. The disorder proved so absolute that even Red Army units experienced confusion of conflict. Soviet tanker Dmitry Loza documented in his recollections that as armor neared from southern direction, Soviet Shermans approached from northern direction. T-34 operators, unaware of the additional Soviet unit's location, ignited the vehicle of battalion leader Nikolai Nikolaevich Maslukov, eliminating him. The Soviets were eliminating each other amid the confusion of the massacre, and yet the killing persisted. Greater than 34% of the surrounded German troops, exceeding 20,000 soldiers, failed to survive the escape effort. One among three never passed through. They perished in frozen terrain, struck down by bombardment, pulverized beneath armor tracks, slashed by mounted troops, or simply frozen during the tempest when injuries or fatigue rendered additional movement unfeasible. The loss percentage surpassed any tolerable military depletion. This transcended engagement. This represented the human price of Hitler's prohibition against withdrawal, calculated in corpses that would remain frozen until spring thaw. When the final survivors staggered across German positions on February 18th, they carried reports of catastrophe. Yet the genuine disaster was merely commencing. The 20,000 deceased at Hell's Gate represented only the start. Korsun-Cherkassy had shattered something considerably more extensive than a single pocket. The full, complete German barrier line throughout Ukraine disintegrated in the direct aftermath. The obliteration at Korsun generated a breach that couldn't be sealed with existing reserves. Formations that could have maintained neighbouring zones needed to relocate to address the void left by the destroyed Korsun pocket. The barrier that had maintained through January abruptly fractured during February. Soviet units streamed through the breaches. In northern sectors, the Soviets secured the lower portion of the Pripyat marshlands. Nothing remained between them and the Carpathian Range. The path toward Romania and Hungary opened wide, Germany's essential southeastern partners. The petroleum sources that maintained the Wehrmacht's mobility abruptly confronted immediate danger. In southern sectors, Germans withdrew from Krivoy Rog, containing its enormous iron deposits and manganese resources. These weren't emblematic defeats. Manganese constituted a critical element for weapons manufacturing, vital for steel alloy and protective plating. The defeat directly affected Germany's capacity to substitute combat casualties in armour and machinery. The strategic ramifications multiplied further. The withdrawal from the lower Dnieper rendered Crimea's protection nearly unfeasible. The slender Perekop Isthmus linking Crimea to mainland could have been maintained by the units obliterated at Korsun-Cherkassy. Without those formations, the complete Crimean deployment confronted eventual surrounding and elimination. The peninsula that Germany had battled to seize in 1941 and 1942 would disappear in 1944, and the origins of that defeat were established in the frozen ground beyond Korsun. A single encirclement provoked methodical breakdowns spanning hundreds of kilometers of defensive line. The elimination of 60,000 soldiers and the casualty of 20,000 additional during a single evening's escape effort didn't merely remove two corps. It removed the backup forces, the protective depth, and the mobile units required to stabilize a changing battlefront. Soviet leadership acknowledged the chance. They exploited the benefit, and the complete German station throughout Ukraine, which had appeared steady during January, became unsustainable by March. Yet the most condemnatory result of Korsun-Cherkassy wasn't what it eliminated during February 1944. It was what it disclosed about forthcoming events. Every component of the catastrophe at Korsun-Cherkassy, Zhukov's synchronization, the swift encirclement, the stronghold directive, the unsuccessful rescue, the escape slaughter, would duplicate on dramatically larger magnitude in merely 4 months. Korsun-Cherkassy proved that the Red Army had perfected operational-grade surrounding combat. The multi-sector synchronization between Konev and Vatutin demonstrated they could coordinate distinct military formations spanning enormous distances. The crushing numerical advantages, 400,000 confronting 60,000, demonstrated they could apply numerical dominance with assurance. The swift encirclement tempo, 4 days from assault to sealed pocket, demonstrated they had mastered moving more rapidly than Wehrmacht leaders could respond. The capability to sustain both an interior perimeter containing the pocket and an exterior perimeter blocking rescue units demonstrated they had resolved the supply challenges that rendered encirclement actions so complex. Every single one of these competencies would resurface at Operation Bagration. Marshal Zhukov's synchronization of several fronts in a unified deep action at Korsun constituted a direct practice run for his function, coordinating the even more devastating multi-sector encirclements that would obliterate Army Group Center. The approaches were matching. The magnitude would prove greater. The result would prove disastrous. The engagement also disclosed the deadly ramifications of Hitler's stronghold philosophy and his prohibition to permit prompt withdrawal. At Korsun, the Führer's command to maintain station squandered the essential days when withdrawal passages remained accessible. His command to execute a counter-encirclement expended time and assets that could have served systematic evacuation. His prohibition to permit escape until circumstances became critical guaranteed that when the escape ultimately transpired, it would occur under the most unfavorable conceivable circumstances. Every single one of these choices would duplicate at Bagration, with even more ruinous outcomes. Despite the obvious forewarning that Soviet operational competencies had achieved a standard that could methodically obliterate German army formations, Wehrmacht high leadership failed to modify protective philosophy or supersede Hitler's prohibition against withdrawal before confronting Bagration. The teachings were apparent. Officers who lived through Hell's Gate transported those teachings back to Wehrmacht positions. They communicated what they had witnessed. They recounted the synchronization, the crushing strength, the rapidity of encirclement, and the disastrous price of postponed escape. Their forewarnings went disregarded at the leadership stratum where choices were rendered. When Operation Bagration detonated throughout Belorussia on June 22, 1944, it wasn't unexpected. It was Korsun-Cherkassy increased tenfold. On this occasion there would exist no survivors to recount the narrative of Hell's Gate. Historical memory preserves Stalingrad. Historical memory preserves Bagration. Yet the engagement that linked them, the practice run that forewarned of everything approaching, has been nearly completely overlooked. Korsun-Cherkassy fills an unusual intermediate position in historical recollection. It transpired too late to group with Stalingrad's pivot point story. The engagement occurred during February 1944, when Germany's loss was already certain to anyone examining manufacturing statistics and strength comparisons. It transpired too early to include in the ultimate breakdown narrative of 1944 and 1945. Bagration, which occurred merely 4 months subsequent, eclipsed Korsun in both magnitude and strategic consequence. The overlooked engagement dropped into the space between the striking pivot point and the ultimate disaster. The engagement also proved every component that rendered Soviet deep actions devastating. Nevertheless, it was sufficiently limited in magnitude that its teachings could be rejected or disregarded by Wehrmacht command as an anomaly instead of a blueprint. 60,000 soldiers surrounded was dreadful, but not extraordinary. 20,000 losses in the escape was ghastly, but not on the level of Stalingrad's 300,000. The breakdown of the Ukrainian barrier was grave, but not instantly terminal to Germany's capacity to pursue the conflict. Every measure indicated Korsun-Cherkassy was a substantial loss, but not a conclusive disaster. This assessment was disastrously incorrect. The engagement's importance resided not in its direct consequence, but in what it disclosed about Soviet competencies and German weaknesses. Korsun-Cherkassy established the Red Army could implement Stalingrad-style encirclements as standard procedure. It established Hitler's stronghold philosophy would convert controllable evacuations into massacres. It established Wehrmacht rescue units couldn't penetrate Soviet barrier stations, even when the surrounded pocket was comparatively limited. Every single one of these teachings indicated toward Bagration, but the scope of Korsun was sufficiently limited that Wehrmacht high leadership could evade addressing the consequences. The 34% loss percentage and the terror of Hell's Gate equaled or surpassed the severity of more celebrated encirclements. Nevertheless, the engagement lacks the emblematic significance of Stalingrad or the strategic conclusiveness of Bagration in widespread comprehension. For the troops who lived through Hell's Gate, staggering through snowstorms while mounted forces slashed their colleagues and bombardment colored snow crimson, Korsun-Cherkassy was far from overlooked. Yet their forewarnings went disregarded at the leadership stratum where strategic choices were rendered. Perhaps Korsun-Cherkassy remains overlooked exactly because remembering it renders the disaster of Bagration even more unpardonable. The forewarning was evident, the teachings were inscribed in casualties, and nobody paid attention. So why does Korsun-Cherkassy signify? because it was the instant when the Eastern battlefront's result became unavoidable, and everyone who required witnessing it turned away. Korsun-Cherkassy was the instant the Red Army established they could duplicate Stalingrad's encirclement, not once, not fortuitously, but methodically as standard procedure deployable at discretion. The 4-day encirclement tempo, the multi-sector synchronization, the crushing numerical advantages, and the capability to sustain both interior and exterior perimeters concurrently proved that the Soviet military had transformed from the frantic defender of 1941 into an attacking powerhouse that could implement complicated actions with exactness. This wasn't the Soviet Union barely enduring. This was the Soviet Union proving command of operational craft. The engagement's 34% loss percentage in the Hell's Gate escape proved the human price of Hitler's stronghold philosophy more transparently than any other individual battle between Stalingrad and Bagration. 20,000 soldiers perished during a single evening because the Führer prohibited permitting withdrawal when evacuation remained still feasible. The straightforward causal connection between Hitler's command to maintain station and the corpses accumulated in frozen terrain couldn't have been more transparent. Every planning officer examining the engagement could perceive that prompt evacuation would have rescued those lives. Yet Hitler's power remained complete and his philosophy remained unaltered. Marshal Zhukov's synchronization at Korsun-Cherkassy was the straightforward operational practice run for his function at Bagration. The identical leader employed the identical approaches to accomplish the identical multi-sector synchronization, but with teachings absorbed and perfected. The encirclement at Korsun required 4 days. The encirclements at Bagration would require less. The numerical proportions at Korsun were 5-1. At Bagration, they would prove even greater. Zhukov extracted everything that succeeded at Korsun and expanded it for the obliteration of Army Group Center. The direct strategic breakdown throughout Ukraine following Korsun-Cherkassy, the disintegration of the complete barrier, forfeiture of essential assets, and vulnerability of partner positions, previewed exactly how Bagration would demolish Army Group Center and expose the route to Berlin. A single encirclement generated cascading breakdowns spanning hundreds of kilometers. The forfeiture of backup forces, protective depth, and mobile units meant neighboring zones couldn't maintain position. The design was evident. The forewarning was clear. And 4 months subsequent, the identical design would duplicate on a magnitude that obliterated a complete German army formation and eliminated or seized 450,000 troops. The account of Korsun-Cherkassy is fundamentally the account of a forewarning disregarded. 60,000 soldiers surrounded, 20,000 deceased in frozen terrain, a complete barrier disintegrated. And 4 months subsequent, when Bagration obliterated Army Group Center and eliminated or seized 450,000 Wehrmacht troops, nobody could claim they hadn't received forewarning. Hell's Gate had revealed to them exactly what was approaching. Korsun-Cherkassy stands as the overlooked smaller Stalingrad. The engagement where the Red Army established they had perfected the operational craft of encirclement, where Hitler's prohibition to permit withdrawal converted controllable evacuation into Hell's Gate slaughter, and where every component of the approaching disaster at Bagration was practiced and disclosed. The 34% who perished in frozen ground, struck down by mounted blades and bombardment in a snowstorm, compensated the cost for teachings that would go unabsorbed. Their deaths proved with arithmetical exactness what transpired when encirclement merged with postponed escape. Their anguish revealed what Hitler's stronghold philosophy signified in human measures. Their loss purchased understanding that could have averted an even greater disaster. When we question how 450,000 Wehrmacht troops could be surrounded and obliterated at Bagration merely 4 months subsequent, the response resides in the frozen slaughter zone beyond Korsun-Cherkassy, where the forewarning was inscribed in casualties, and nobody with authority to respond chose to examine it. Zhukov revealed his approaches. Hitler disclosed his rigidity. The how combination established fatal, and the design duplicated because the teaching went unabsorbed. Historical memory overlooked Korsun-Cherkassy. but the soldiers who perished there purchased the understanding that could have averted an even greater disaster. That their loss was disregarded renders this overlooked engagement not merely sorrowful, but unpardonable. 20,000 soldiers perished, revealing exactly what would transpire at Bagration. The forewarning couldn't have been more transparent. The price couldn't have been steeper. And when the disaster arrived during June 1944, obliterating Army Group Center and exposing the route to Berlin, the spirits of Hell's Gate could have informed them they had witnessed it all previously. The snowstorm that struck on February 16, 1944, ultimately subsided. The corpses frozen in terrain ultimately defrosted. Yet the teaching inscribed in casualties and mounted assaults and bombardment persisted, awaiting someone with power and bravery to examine it. Nobody did. And so Korsun-Cherkassy remains what it has perpetually been. The overlooked practice run for the disaster that terminated Nazi Germany's capacity to protect the Eastern battlefront. Historical memory may have overlooked the designation, but the design it disclosed, encirclement, postponement, escape, slaughter, became the blueprint for Red Army triumph. The 20,000 who perished at Hell's Gate merited superior than being overlooked. They merit being the forewarning that was observed. Instead, they became the introduction to an even greater sorrow, evidence that occasionally the most significant engagements are the ones historical memory chooses to disregard. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.